What's shaking, booktube? My name's Cam and welcome back to another video. Today I am doing a discussion video. Today I want to have a chat with you about something that happened about a month ago. So it was around the end of August, start of September, and I'm almost sure you would have heard of it if you keep your ear to the ground in regards to book-related stuff. But essentially this is the whole situation with Lani Sarem and her book, Handbook for Mortals, and the scandal, so to speak, of it becoming a #1 bestseller. I've actually already discussed this in my most recent podcast, which I'll link in the description below, but after I did that podcast, I realized there's so much more information and it just gets so much more weird. I just needed to make a video on this because it gets really weird and there's a lot happening there. Anyway, let's get into it. Roll the intro. This is by no means an expose. I mean, all of the stuff I'm going to be mentioning has already been mentioned, and of course I'm going to link all of my sources below because there's a lot of research I did on this, a lot of information that was uncovered by people's investigations where I think they deserve the credit. But I think this may essentially be the only video where all of that information is compiled into a all you need to know kind of video. And as I said, I have already discussed this a bit in the podcast that I'll link below for my podcast, the Book Wolves podcast, but I didn't really talk specifically about this situation so much. I just used it as an example for talking about people scamming the New York Times bestseller list as a whole. So as a quick summary, in case you didn't know, what happened was, out of nowhere this book popped up as the #1 bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. Seemingly no one had heard of it. It was a debut author, publisher, and everyone was just confused. No one knew who she was, what this book was. There seemingly hadn't been any advertisements on a major scale to award it the #1 bestseller spot. So of course people came to the conclusion that it got that spot through, I wouldn't say sinister, but shady ways. And as it turns out, it did. So to make it onto the New York Times bestseller list, you have to sell between 5,000 to 10,000 books in a week. And that's just to make it onto the list. So this book became #1, and that's because they sold 18,000 in a week. And this is a book, again, that no one had really heard of. There were no blog posts or press from major book media leading up to this, so everyone was confused. Anyway, the best place for me to start with this discussion is to give you a timeline of what happened from the start to the end. So right at the very start, you have this woman called Lani Sarem, who was a manager for a bunch of bands, semi-popular. I mean, the most popular of which I think would have been Plain White T's. You know that song that everyone plays when they first start learning guitar, Hey There, Delilah? Yeah, she was a band manager for those guys and a bunch of other bands as well. But essentially after that, she approached this actor that you may be familiar with. I think his name's Thomas Ian Nicholas. He's really a C or D list celebrity, and I mean, in the 90s he was a bit bigger. He was Kevin from American Pie. He was also in some other movies that I'm not familiar with. I think they're kind of American, sort of like American classics. Either way, he was big-ish in the 90s. So Lani Sarem approaches him because he's also a musician, and she wanted to put together a band of musicians that are also actors. And although that didn't go anywhere, she did pitch to Thomas this script she had for a movie, Handbook for Mortals. Thomas had some notes, but he did like what he saw, so she was recommended to turn it into an actual book series as well, so that she could get that kind of YA audience, which really is a smart business move. There's nothing wrong with that. They were aiming for kind of like a Harry Potter situation. The issue is that she had no real actual writing experience, and she's even said herself that she's not a very good writer, so normally what you would do in that situation is get a ghostwriter, but she didn't do that. Anyway, I will go further into that a bit later. We're just doing the timeline right now. So after that she wrote the book, and this is another bit where it gets weird. She wrote the book with specific actors in mind, and she wrote the book for the purpose of a movie. And that's one way to fuck up a novel, is to write it just thinking about how it would be as a movie. Because then really you're just writing a script in a different format, and that doesn't ever turn out to be a good book. A book that is written for the purpose of being a script. But it's weird because she wrote actors into it like Carrot Top. Carrot Top was promised a role in the movie, so she wrote a character for Carrot Top into the book. It's just weird. Anyway, after that, leading up to... So she wrote the book. Thomas gave it the go-ahead, and they started doing some small promotions. For example, they were taking... so they didn't even have a cover at this point, keep in mind. They didn't have a cover. All they had was the plot and the book, and that's how they were selling it. So they were taking it to things like Wizard World Comic Con, which is a very small scale version of Comic Con. It's like Comic Con, but with celebrities that are kind of not really celebrities anymore. And I'm not trying to roast Wizard World Comic Con here. I mean, I would go to that equivalent if they had it here, but it's just not a large scale thing. And she was doing promotion for it on really small platforms, like, for example, a YouTube channel called, what was it? It was I think it's the 3 Geeks channel or 3 Geeks Network. Anyway, I'll link those guys below. But here's the thing about those guys, first of all. So they got a lot of dislikes on their stuff after all this controversy came out, as if they somehow contributed to that situation. But they didn't. I mean, they did the interview with her before the book even came out, before the scandal happened. So I feel bad for them. And their interview was actually really good. They have a good interview format. They kept it entertaining. I would recommend checking out their channel because I do actually enjoy their content. I only found them through research for this, but those guys are actually pretty cool, and I feel bad that they've copped some flack over something they had no control over. But yeah, my point is that that's a really small YouTube channel, and she was doing promotion through stuff like that. So these are really small platforms. Anyway, after that, the book comes out on the 15th of August, I believe it was, and within that week, it's #1 bestseller. It sold 18,000. It immediately copped a lot of backlash because people were rightfully suspicious, and because it pushed another book from the #1 spot, The Hate You Give, which is obviously massive. It's being talked about everywhere. If you're watching booktube videos, you've seen videos on The Hate You Give. And it's an important book as well. It raises important themes, and people were pissed off that Handbook for Mortals pushed that out of the way under suspicious circumstances. Further on from that, they started promoting the movie as soon as that happened because they were riding the high of being a #1 New York Times bestseller. And the thing is, they cast themselves as the 2 main characters, Thomas and Lani. And from my understanding, it was meant to be a book about, I mean, obviously I haven't read it, but she's in her late teens or early 20s, the character. And God, it's a pretentious thing to cast yourself in that way. I mean, that's subjective, that's my opinion, but that seems kind of douchey. I mean, the synopsis for the book itself, I'm not going to read it out because I'm trying to keep this video timely and it's already probably running a bit long. But essentially, if you read the synopsis, which you'll obviously find linked below, it's cringy. Even the synopsis itself is cringy. It mentions in the synopsis that there's a love triangle, which is obviously something that at this point people are begging to stop. And yeah, and then last step on that train was that obviously the situation was exposed. There were people who did the research and found that it was very suspicious, the circumstances, and through further research found that the suspicion was well placed. You had people like Phil Stamper and Kaylee Donaldson who did the research and found that what had happened is, well, the suspicion at this point is that they used something called Result Source, which in itself is a shady-ass website which basically would purchase the books that you put out from distributors that contributed data to the New York Times bestseller lists. Result Source would pull smallish amounts of that book in bulk from separate places to make it look legit. And it's hard to defend that website as not being shady when, after they were exposed as well, the website took down their whole landing page and now it's just a contact form. Yeah, not suspicious. So these guys got in touch with some of the bookstores that contributed large amounts of data to the New York Times bestseller list for Handbook for Mortals, and what they were told was that someone, in some cases claiming to be a Thomas, had called up and bought in bulk. And we're talking thousands of books from these bookstores within the first week. It's obviously suspicious. The initial defense from these guys was that it was legitimate. Their rise to the number one spot was legitimate. And of course, after the step of denial, they moved to making excuses. And the excuse initially was that they had sold 18,000 copies through pre-orders at Wizard World book cons, and they were purchasing those books within that week so that they could distribute them to the people that had bought them. If you ignore the fact that seems highly unlikely due to the numbers of people that attend Wizard World book cons, I mean, essentially you're saying that almost 99% of the people that attended the Wizard World book cons bought the book before there was a cover, before there was even something for them to really look at. It sounds like bullshit. But even if you took their word at that, the fact that they did that all within the first week, specifically checking if those bookstores contributed data to the New York Times bestseller list, everyone knows what you were doing. The fact is they were busted, and after they were busted, obviously after the excuse stage, Lani Sarem went on to make a few statements, and again, I'm going to link everything below. She made a few statements that seemed as though she was playing the victim card and blamed the YA community for what happened. Now, I said in my podcast that I felt bad for her in this situation because I wasn't sure if she was aware of this whole thing that was happening and this has ruined her career and all that. I don't feel bad for her anymore. I read the statements and it's a complete fucking cop-out. And in some cases, she even claimed the YA community was toxic for reacting in such a way. And of course, you're going to get people that, go way overboard with their outrage. But to put any kind of blame on a community as a whole because you scammed the system, and you can make excuses, but you scammed the system. To blame the community and call it toxic is basically just a giant middle finger. She tried to play the victim card, tried to say that there was an unfair bias, as if that's what the outrage was concerning. It's got nothing to do with any of the groups that you fall into. It's to do with the fact that you did something extremely dishonest. Anyway, I'm letting my personal opinion get a bit too woven into this. Back to the actual information. So, as if to make all of this even worse, the cover was copied. So you look at the cover and then you look at an original artwork from an artist called Gil DeMace. I hope I said that right. But you can see it's copied. Now, the guy who designed the actual cover for Handbook for Mortals, he did cop a bit of flack, but he came out with a statement saying that he was asked to do this cover as a homage to that artwork. So, I mean, first of all, that's them accepting that yes, they copied it. But it's saying that the artist was under the impression that this person was aware that this was happening. Obviously, it turned out they weren't, because through investigation from Kaylee Donaldson, she contacted the people who represent that artist, and they had no idea about this. No one had contacted them to ask permission to rip off that artwork. And now that poor cover designer has probably had his reputation ruined. Hopefully he's being honest when he says he was under the impression. He probably should have done some investigation of his own before doing a homage. He should have made sure, but even still, he's not the person in charge of doing that. You can pause the video to read through some of the responses that Kaylee found from the representatives of that artwork, but everything I've mentioned it's happened, and it's just unreal to think that this much shady shit happened with one book and not one person thought this might backfire. When all this controversy happened as well, one of the bands that Lani used to manage came out with a tweet that was since deleted that kind of, it seemed like they weren't surprised she would do something like this, which leads me even further to believe that she knew all this was happening. Look, end of the day, it's a simple fact that this has not ended well for Lani Sarem. The book, I'm almost positive the movie's not going to happen. If it does, that would be a very poor business decision. Obviously, it hasn't gone well. You can look at the reviews on Amazon. It's not good. I don't think Lani intends on having a career in writing, but it seems at this point she's ruined her reputation entirely, and if she is looking for anything on that front in any form of media, she's probably going to have to take up a different name. Like I said, as you can see, this video has already gone quite long, but there is so much more information involved, so I'm going to link everything below. I think it's pretty clear what my opinion is on this. I don't like people being dishonest, and like I said in the podcast, Lani's not the only person to have ever done this, but they made the poor decision of boosting it up enough to become number one and put them in the spotlight. Any future Handbook for Mortals had, any future the movie had, I think at this point has been completely torn to shit. I think the name Lani Sarem in terms of writing has been torn to shit, and honestly, I don't feel bad. Let me know what you think of the whole situation below. If you want to read more into the crazy whirlwind of shit that's gone on with this controversy. It's just nuts. There's so much more weird stuff that happened. Make sure you check out the podcast because that's where I do most of my discussion type stuff. That's why I don't really do a whole lot of discussion videos anymore, so that I can save those ideas for the podcast. Follow me on Twitter if you aren't already. That's where I'm most active. And all my other social media links are down there as well. Thanks so much for watching. If you haven't already, join the Wolfpack and subscribe. And if you are in the Wolfpack, I'll see you in the next video. Catch ya.